Hi, friends. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about what is Linux. You may have heard about Linux, so I wanted to give my perspective as to what it is, where it came from, how it's made, and maybe this will also help explain what you can do with it. So, what is Linux? I guess at the most basic level, it's an operating system, just like Microsoft Windows or Apple OS X. It's the bit of software that you first encounter when you power on your computer. It's what manages the hardware, it's what you use to manage your files, and it's what you use to launch the programs that you actually run on your computer. So, for instance, here I just did an image search for a laptop running Windows. This is probably what most of us are used to seeing. And on the right, it's a laptop running Linux. You can see the screen looks a little different because it's not Windows. It's if the software part of the computer you interface with as it boots. I guess that's the best way to describe it. So where did this come from? It's the culmination of something called the GNU project, which was started in 1983 by a gentleman named Richard Stallman while he was at MIT. The goal of the GNU project was to create an operating system built entirely out of free software. It was motivated by the philosophical belief that only through free software are computer users actually in control of their computer. Linux is named after another gentleman named Linus Torvalds, whose involvement in Linux, in my opinion, was mostly inconsequential. The real creator of Linux is Richard Stallman, but this other guy got all the credit. As an aside, it was called the GNU project. It's a recursive acronym, kind of some nerd humor. GNU stands for GNU is not Unix. It's a joke because Linux is very Unix-like. Unix was an operating system from earlier days of computing. So Unix was the commercial operating system of its day. They wanted to create a free replacement for that. So what is this free software that these guys were trying to create, or that Richard Stallman was trying to create? I thought one way of defining it is how Richard Stallman defines the freedoms that are baked into free software. So with free software, such as Linux, and unlike Microsoft and unlike Apple, you are guaranteed the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. You are granted the freedom to study how the program works and change it so that it does your computing as you wish. Access to the source code is a precondition for this. We'll talk about source code later. You have the freedom to redistribute copies so you can help your neighbor. And you have the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others. The idea is that others can benefit from your upgrades, your changes. Access to the source code is a precondition for this. All these freedoms are dependent on you having access to what is called the source code. And so, in comparison, I guess in a way of defining what free software is, we can compare and contrast with what free software is not. So most non-free software, which is pretty much almost all software you've ever used, is packaged so that you can't know what the software is actually doing. You can't study the program, you can't modify it. It doesn't matter if you're a programmer. It's encoded so that it's a black box of mystery, right? And presumably it does what they say it does. So to protect your freedom to study and modify and share free software, the free software that they were creating, the GNU Foundation also developed a unique software license that they call the GPL, the GNU Public License. They jokingly also refer to this as copyleft. So the free software refers to libre as in freedom, not gratis as it's free of cost. So sometimes you'll see the Spanish words used to more accurately describe what is meant by free, or you'll hear that it's free as in freedom, not free as in free beer. And I think this is probably the most powerful statement I've heard about free software, and it also came from Stallman, the creator of this movement. Free software is useful knowledge in a usable form, and it's literally that. It's useful knowledge in a usable form. So, what is free software? It's also an example of a massive public collaborative project. Think of Wikipedia. In fact, the founders of Wikipedia were inspired by the free software movement when they saw the power of people collaborating together. And that's what Linux is. It's a bunch of people around the world motivated and united across this idea of free software. The other thing about it is that it works. It's a meritocracy. This free software movement has produced extremely high quality software. And you may associate Linux with security. I think it might have that mystique of maybe it's what geeks use, computer science types. And I think part of the reason it was used by anybody who wants to study computing. If you're really interested in studying software, then you're probably interested in free software. The other reason is a lot of the mainframes and a lot of the critical infrastructure runs Linux. It's being used everywhere. It's been adopted by companies who don't care about freedom or human dignity. They just want access to powerful software that's reliable and works. Large corporations, they use it to run their servers. And this might come as a surprise. This is something that I found surprising when I started digging into this. Why is this collaborative process where the software is just shared freely and people make improvements as they see fit? Why does that work? Why doesn't it just lead to chaos? If you want to dig deeper, the best explanation I have come across is a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric Raymond. I think it does a good job of explaining why this works to produce high quality software. I mentioned copyleft. What is copyleft? And again, some nerd humor, and this is the symbol associated with it. So most software is copyrighted. That's designed to limit your freedoms and limit what you can do with the software. Copyleft is the opposite of copyright. It protects your freedoms to use the software in any way you wish. Copyleft protects these freedoms by requiring that all the software be distributed with the source code. I've been mentioning source code. So what is source code? When programmers create software, they do so by writing text files in something called source code. If you were to open up source code, you would see that it looks kind of like a mix of English and math and is the human readable form of the program. I have an image here on the left. I did an image search for source code. Hopefully you can kind of make out some English words mixed in with some numbers, and it's got some parentheses and some math operators. That's source code. It's color coded. A lot of thought goes into making this as easy to read for the programmer as possible. So that's the human readable form, and it's meant to be intelligible. If you understand the programming language, it's designed to be as intelligible as possible. You can read it and understand what it's doing. Problem is, computers don't run source code, generally speaking. After the programmer creates a software using source code in this kind of human readable form, it's compiled. That's what this arrow is supposed to represent. And it's compiled into a binary file. A binary file is actually what the computer runs. Now, the problem with binary files is it's almost impossible to know what this thing is doing by just looking at it. But that's actually what your computer runs. And almost any piece of software you've ever bought, actually probably certainly any piece of software you've ever bought or you've downloaded or anything that Microsoft has ever done for you has been in binary format only. Who knows what it's doing? So why is source code important? I've been talking about it and I kind of hinted at it. So if you don't have source code, it's impossible to know what the software is actually doing. So you need it in order to understand it. You need it in order to study the software. This is useful if you want to learn how to program and understand how computers work. It's also important, actually it's critical, if you want to change its behavior to meet your needs, to add functionality, to fix bugs, etc. And that's what makes Linux and software distributed as free software, as part of the free software movement or the open source movement. That's what makes it different. The license requires that the software always come with a source. So this is again Richard Stallman. Free software means the users have the freedom to run, copy, distribute, study, change, and improve the software. You might be thinking, I'm not a programmer. Why does this matter to me? Well, even if you yourself are not studying the source code to check for bugs, to check for backdoors, to make sure that it's actually doing what it claims to be doing, you're benefiting from a huge community of nerds around the world that are doing this. And that's what's led to Linux's incredible stability and security. I think we have this idea that most bugs are caused by a typo, right? They entered a period instead of a comma. Turns out that most bugs are subtle flaws in logic. And they're subtle and they're hard to catch. And that's the big advantage that open source software has over commercial software, is that there are a million eyeballs. Anybody can look at it. Anybody can look at the program because they have access to the source code, and these subtle flaws in logic are obvious to someone. Whereas with commercial software, it's just the development team, the guys that actually were creating it. Then they ship out the software. The rest of the world can't study the program and try to help figure out why it's buggy, or it's prone to viruses or whatever. I hope this has been useful to somebody. Any questions, please send me a message, and I'd love to help in any way I can.